So this I have just posted on Blackboard not too long ago. So you can download that from Blackboard and follow along, or you can just follow along from your screen. All right, so we are talking about the science of psychology today. The science of psychology is the science or the study of psyche, which is the soul. And how do we study the soul? Because the soul is something that is immaterial. Well, here's the history of the study of the mind and the soul. The Greek philosophers argued about what the mind is. Some of them thought it was something inside of our head or in our body. Others thought that it was something that was like a spirit that was separate from the body. And the debate continues to today. But in mainstream psychology, they take this debate for granted and think more in terms of the brain and the body and the mind are all one thing, kind of like we're all physical flesh. That's not to say that that's true, it's just the current state of the debate. The debate that is not really going on anymore in psychology. Early psychology labs attempted to use introspection. This was the first and earliest method of approaching psychology as a science. And also psychophysics, but we're not going to talk about that. Modern psychology researchers, nowadays we measure behavior, whether conscious or unconscious. An example of a conscious behavior is eating, or drinking, or sitting, and an unconscious behavior would be an electrodermal response. When you see a word on a screen, maybe it's a bad word and it makes you have an emotional response, we can detect that through your skin by a change in its electrical conductivity. So that would be an example of an unconscious behavioral measure. I'll pause right here and ask if there are any questions or comments. Am I speaking too fast or too slow? Or is everything going okay for you on your side? There's a thumbs up. Okay. Feel free to turn on your microphone and speak up. If you have any questions, you can interrupt me during this lecture. So just speak up if you have any concern or a question or anything. Okay? All right, so we are on the third slide. The goals of psychology. Psychology is defined as a scientific study of behavior. Like other sciences, it attempts to do these three things: explain, predict, and modify. So you see that in any science like geology, physics, biology. They always try to explain, predict, and modify whatever medium they are working with. In this case, psychology is the science of behavior, so we try to explain, predict, and modify behavior. Like other sciences, it is important that psychological data are objective, reliable, and valid. Now, you might want to write down a short definition of these things in case you don't know what objective means. Objective means that others can verify your results. They can see it's not only visible to you, it's visible to others. If it were only visible to you, that would be subjective. So science relies on objective data, data that can be verified by others. It is reliable. That means that the results can be reproduced. Others can do the same thing that you did and get the same results, or approximately the same. The more that the results can be replicated, the more reliable we call it. We call that the measurement is reliable. So we want to work with reliable tools in science. Can you imagine what would happen if our tools were not reliable? One scientist would measure one thing, another scientist would measure the same thing and get a different answer. Science could not progress. So we need reliable tools. And the third one is validity. Data must be valid. That means that what the data are claimed to measure must actually be measured. Or another way to put it is that if your tool is valid, it means that it measures what you say that it measures. For example, a meter ruler measures height, and if you try to use your ruler to measure weight, then that's not valid, because a valid instrument is one that measures what it is supposed to measure. All right, any questions so far? Go ahead and turn on your mic and ask any question you'd like. Okay, if there are no questions, please someone feel free to turn on your mic and say, no questions.
No question.
All right, thank you. It's nice to hear students' voices sometimes. Next slide. Scientific research. A hypothesis is a testable statement. For example, the moon is a sphere. Is that true? Well, we can make the hypothesis first, and then it needs to be testable, so we would need satellites or some kind of way of precisely measuring it in three-dimensional space. All right. Operational definitions define how to test a hypothesis. So, for example, hot weather makes people less patient. Now that, I claim, is not testable yet. The reason is that we don't know what hot weather means. Hot weather might mean something different to different people. And people, we don't know which people. And we don't know what patient means exactly, or how it's measured, or how it could be defined. So in order to make this a testable hypothesis, we need to define our terms in the hypothesis. So we're going to revise this hypothesis as follows. As temperature increases above 27 degrees Celsius, college students will spend fewer minutes helping a lost tourist find his destination. Now we have defined our terms, and we have phrased it in a way that is measurable, because a hypothesis must be measurable in order to be testable. So a testable hypothesis must be operationally defined. And operationally defining means defining in a way that we can measure it in order to determine whether the hypothesis is true or false. All right, now do your best to rephrase this hypothesis to be testable. Hot cocoa gives people happiness. don't have to define hot cocoa. We assume that people know what that is. But define happiness in a way that can be measured. Now, if anyone in the class would like to offer your definition of happiness in a measurable way, an operational definition of happiness, please turn on your mic and say it. Anyone please offer your definition, your operational definition of happiness? I see that everyone's microphone is muted. We've got a lot of students in the class. So I'm waiting for anyone to offer your operational definition of happiness. So a way that you could measure whether or not hot cocoa gives people happiness. How could you determine that? How could you measure to see if that's true?
Measure like stimulation of hormone.
Stimulation of hormones. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Great. Very good. And you could measure hormones through blood sample or saliva test. Very good. So now we have a testable hypothesis. We might say hot cocoa makes people release more of hormone X or hormone Y, or less of that. Great. Okay. I hope that makes sense. I'll go on to the next slide. There are two types of research data that can be collected: qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative data is the kind of data that is a verbal description. It often is in the form of adjectives: hot, cold, comfortable, painful, sad, happy. These are adjectives, these are descriptions, usually verbal descriptions of data. So qualitative data is often subjective data. It is people reporting how they feel, or what they think, what they believe. So it's descriptive and it's verbal. The methods and results are in the form of verbal descriptions. For example, boys engage in more gender-consistent role-playing than girls. Actually, that's sort of quantitative as well, because it implies that you measured and counted role-playing behavior and to make that statement. So that's not exactly a great example. But a qualitative method is one in which you're not collecting numbers, you're collecting reports or verbal reports or statements or descriptions. Quantitative data is the more common type of data that we collect in psychological science, because quantitative data can be analyzed with statistics. The methods and results are in the form of numerical descriptions. An example is young drivers commit 1.3 times more risky driving maneuvers than others. So these are the two basic types of research data. Methods of psychological science. Each method can be qualitative or quantitative. And I'm going to go over a bunch of methods now. First one, introspection studies. One of the earliest methods of these studies was one of the earliest methods of psychology was introspection, because it's unclear how we measure mental life. So one early method that was proposed was we measure mental life by asking participants to report on their own mental life. But this method fell into disrepute because the scientific method requires objectivity, and it is hard to verify a person's thoughts and feelings if no one else can look inside of their head to see and verify if they are really feeling that and thinking that, or if they are just mistaking how to describe it and making a mistake with what they feel and what they think. So, this isn't the greatest method. It's not very often used today, but it was one of the earliest methods devised. It was used back in the 1800s, late 1800s, when the first psychology lab and scientists, and when the field first began. An example is a patient can report physical pain better than a nurse or doctor can, because they can look within to explain their feelings. So, because patients can do this better than doctors, and because pain or symptoms can be more easily and quickly and accurately reported by the patient than by anything else, usually, so we frequently depend on introspection in the doctor's office, for example, or in the psychologist's office. We ask our participants to report on how they're feeling and what they think about things. So it's still very used, it's just not used so much in a scientific way or in a laboratory. The advantage is that it gives excellent subjective experience. The disadvantage is that it's not very objective. And so it's not very replicable or reliable also. All right, the next slide is on case studies. An example is Sigmund Freud. You might have heard of him. He's one of the earliest and most well-known psychologists. He performed some studies of a patient named Anna O. The advantage of this method is that it tells a story. It's memorable. Stories are memorable and informative. This gives a much greater degree of attention to many characteristics of the participant. So you can get a lot of biographical information, observation notes, journals, letters, photographs. This is good for developing hunches or scientific theories, or hypotheses, based on your observations of a single participant. The disadvantage is that we don't know whether other participants would behave in the same manner as this particular studied individual. There's a limited sample size, usually just one. Now I'm going to read to you a description of the studies about Anna O. She suffered from hysteria, in which the patient exhibits physical symptoms without a physical cause. Her doctor treated Anna by helping her to recall forgotten memories of traumatic events. She developed a fear of drinking when a dog she hated drank from her glass, and she had some psychological difficulties with her father. She was unconscious of her anxiety at first, but during psychoanalysis, she reported that she was anxious and identified some unconscious thoughts. When she did this, her paralysis disappeared. Freud heard about her case and was so influenced that he wrote Studies of Hysteria in 1895, a book. And he proposed that physical symptoms are often the surface manifestations of deeply repressed conflicts. And his book helped to shape the future and the field of psychology early on. So this was an example of a case study that was very well known and very influential to the field of psychology. Are there any questions right now? Or comments? Okay. This is an example of a case study that was published relatively recently, 6 years ago. A case study of a couple of twins. So the point is that case studies are still relied upon and used today and result in published articles in scientific journals. Next, naturalistic observations. These are studies in which we observe behavior as it unfolds in a natural setting. And Jane Goodall was famous for her studies of chimpanzees. She would go out into the wild and sit quietly with notepad in hand, and she would study the chimpanzees' behavior. She had to be friendly with them because otherwise they would be scared away. So she became accepted and friendly with their group so that she could sit among them and study their behavior. She was able to provide details of distinct personalities of individual members of the group and studied their complex society and behaviors. The advantage of this type of method is that we can study behavior in the natural environment. So this is a good place for developing great, strong theories that are grounded in natural habitats. The disadvantage is that it's often unclear why people or apes or any members that you're studying behave as they do. The next method is experimental studies. This is the gold standard for science, at least in many sciences. It's the least susceptible to criticisms. It is the most convincing to other researchers. An example is Loftus and Palmer's car crash study, which I'm going to read to you. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus wondered how information given after an event can affect eyewitness testimony. Her hypothesis was that leading questions could distort and alter eyewitness testimony, causing people to misreport what they saw and what they remembered based on the cues from the question. The test was, people were asked to estimate the speed of motor vehicles using different forms of questions. People are generally poor at estimating the speeds of vehicles. So participants watched traffic accidents on film, and they were presented afterwards, they were asked to describe what happened as if they were the eyewitnesses. They were then asked to specify specific questions, including questions about how fast were the cars going before they, and then the keyword was replaced in different conditions. Some participants were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they collided into each other? Others were asked when they bumped into each other, and others when they hit each other, and others when they contacted each other. So the manipulation, which is the independent variable, was the wording of the question using the words smashed, collided, bumped, hit, and contacted. The independent variable was the speed that was reported by the participants. When they were asked about how fast were the cars going, the estimation of the speed, which is marked here on this graph on this slide, was estimated differently depending on which word choice was used. So these 5 word choices are the 5 conditions of the experiment. The experimental conditions are called the independent variable. So the independent variable has 5 conditions or 5 levels. And those levels or conditions are provided here on this graph. That's called the independent variable. So the independent variable is on the x-axis. The dependent variable is on the y-axis. It is the speed that participants estimated the cars traveling. All right. The results of this study suggest that eyewitness testimony might be biased by the way that the questions are asked after a crime is committed. Memory for an event is highly flexible. New information given during the interval between witnessing and recalling an event can modify the memory. This is a huge study finding, and this was very influential on how court testimony is accepted in court nowadays because of this study. So, psychological studies often have strong bearing on other fields such as law, perhaps economics, definitely economics, and most definitely many, perhaps all other fields, because all fields are fields studied by humans, and humans, well, the more that we know about them, the more that influences all other fields. So psychology really does have far-reaching influence and impact on other fields. Another example of an experimental study is the effect of coffee on memory. So, an example of a research hypothesis, or it could be a research question or a research hypothesis, depending on how it's phrased. If it's phrased in terms of a question, we call it a research question. If it's a statement, we call it a hypothesis. So, coffee makes people learn better. Well, that's not a very good hypothesis because we don't know what learn better means. So we can define that hypothesis more with a better operational definition by changing learn better to recall more words from a word list studied for 1 minute. We could have the independent variable have 3 levels, 0, 100, and 500 milligrams. So there are 3 levels of this independent variable. The dependent variable could be words recalled after a 5-minute delay. So participants study the word list for a minute, then they get a 5-minute delay where they're given a crossword puzzle to complete or something else to do. And then they are given the test, a word recall test. Perhaps it's free recall, so participants can recall the words in any order as they think about them. Then we can count the words, and that is our dependent variable. Any questions? All right. This is yet a 3rd example of an experimental study illustrated in the picture. But first, let me say, crucial to experimental studies is random assignment to conditions, as well as sample representativeness of the population. In this example, this is rabbit-assisted therapy, the effect of this kind of therapy on self-esteem, depression, and happiness of orphans at the Rajviti Home for Girls. This is an orphanage located in Bangkok. I think it's in Ratchathani. So this diagram illustrates how a sample from the population of orphans is selected. In this case, the selection is orphans at a particular orphanage. And then some of this group is assigned to a control group, and others are assigned to an experimental group. The experimental group gets rabbits to play with, and a control group gets some other kind of therapy. Sometimes they get nothing at all, and sometimes they get an alternative kind of therapy. Sometimes it's not ethical to give nothing at all, because it's unethical to not help people if we have tools to help them and they're participating in a study. We might need to give them some kind of a basic kind of helping tool. And we compare the basic tool to the experimental tool, the one that we want to find out if it works or not. So in this case, the tool is rabbits. So each orphan is given a rabbit to play with, or maybe in groups. And then we measure afterwards, after the therapy session, we could measure 3 different dependent variables: self-esteem, depression, and happiness. So we could do that with checklists. We could measure their facial expressions, or we could give them a little quiz where they're asked questions about their self-esteem or their depression or happiness. So we measure afterwards. All right. So the independent variable is the program or treatment. The dependent variable is those things that were just mentioned. Any questions? All right. One more slide about experimental studies. Often an experimental group is compared to a control group. An example is Group A participants are given toothpaste with fluoride in it. Group B are given toothpaste with no fluoride in it. And then the number of cavities that develop over a 1-year period is compared between the 2 groups. Perhaps Group 1 has 30 people and 1 person developed a cavity. And Group B also has 30 people in it and maybe 3 people developed cavities. So then we would compare the groups to see whether there was a difference. What's the independent variable in this experiment? Please, anyone? Anyone, please answer. Switch on your microphone. What is the independent variable?
Independent variable is the toothpaste.
Can you say that louder?
The toothpaste. The toothpaste. One of it is the one with fluoride, another one without.
Perfect. And the dependent variable. What is the dependent variable here? Maybe someone else answer?
Area and cavity.
Can you say that louder?
Tooth decay and cavity.
It was hard for me to hear. Sorry, I don't know what you said. Maybe speak louder, closer to the microphone. I don't know.
The dependent variable is the tooth decay and cavities.
Thank you. Precisely. All right, next is the placebo effect. Those who think they receive a treatment may obtain the expected benefits. That's kind of a miracle, isn't it? If they did not receive the treatment, but they still get the benefit of the treatment, how does that work? We don't really know. So the placebo effect is this very interesting phenomenon. To separate the placebo effect from the experimental effect, scientists devised the double-blind studies. What does that mean? It means that the participant does not know which group they are in, and the experimenter also does not know which group the participant is in. Because if the experimenter knew, then the participant would look at the experimenter's face and try to guess whether they were part of the experimental group or not. And sometimes the experimenter accidentally gives it away with their facial expressions in their expectation of benefits, which is experimenter bias, which then can spread to the participants. So in order to prevent all of that, in the interest of science, we have devised the double-blind study, where neither the experimenter nor the participant knows which group the participant is assigned to. Okay, I'm going on to the next part, or actually, yes. Field experiments, or natural experiments. These are studies that are done in people's natural environment, just like natural observation, like Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees. But the difference between that and this is that this is an actual experiment, meaning that some people are given an experimental condition and others a control condition or some other condition. So, an example is Halfing's hospital study on obedience. I'm going to read that to you now. Halfing's study involved a naturalistic field experiment involving 22 night nurses, real nurses. But he put I think he called himself Dr. Smith, and he called the nurses at the hospital on 22 separate occasions. So every time a new nurse was on duty, he called and did this experiment with them. He asked them to check to see if they had the drug aspartame in their stock. When the nurse checks, she sees that the maximum dosage is 10 milligrams. When they report to the doctor, they are told to, so the doctor, Dr. Smith, tells them to administer 20 milligrams, which is double the dose, to a particular patient named Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones is just a fake patient who's acting like a patient in the hospital. So Dr. Smith appears to be in a desperate hurry. He says he's in a big hurry, and he will sign the authorization form when he comes to see Mr. Jones later on. The medication was not real. It was just a sugar pill. But the nurses thought that it was a real pill, a real drug. If the nurses administered the drug, they will have broken 3 hospital rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone. The dose was double the maximum limit on the box. And the medicine itself was not authorized because it was not on the ward stock list, a list of authorized medicines. The drug itself was a harmless sugar pill, but 21 out of 22 nurses were easily influenced into carrying out the orders of the doctor over the phone. Later on, another group of 22 nurses was asked whether they would have obeyed the doctor if they were on duty. So it was a hypothetical question. 21 out of 22 nurses said that they would not comply with that order when it was phrased in a hypothetical tense. The whole thing demonstrated that people are very willing to comply with authority and that they don't think that they are. Because they will do it when they're actually doing their job in the real world and they think it's not a test. But when they know it's a test and they're asked the question whether or not they would say no. So this is a very interesting finding, and it was conducted in the field because to get participants' real behavior as they would really behave in real life, sometimes we have to measure them in their natural habitat. In this case, the natural habitat of nurses was when they're on duty in the hospital. The advantage of this method is that environment is more real, and the disadvantage is less control. So we don't know why the nurses behaved that way. It could be because they bend to authority, or it could be because of something unusual about that hospital or that group of nurses. We don't know because it's not a perfectly controlled experiment. Okay, now I'm going on to correlational studies. First of all, do you guys want a break? If you want a break, raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing only one thumbs up. So I guess there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so let's have a 10-minute break. I'm going to continue this lecture at 2 o'clock. Okay, welcome back. Can you hear me? I think so. All right. Correlation studies are non-experimental studies that investigate how one variable is related to another variable. So these variables could be related positively, negatively, or not at all. A correlation coefficient is an index ranging from -1 to +1. A positive number means the relationship goes this direction in the positive correlations graph. Negative correlation goes the other direction. It's the opposite relationship between the variables. No correlation means no relationship between variables. So the variables are represented by the x-axis and the y-axis in a graphing space. Does that make sense? I hope it does. An example is the relation between happiness and money. A positive relation between these would mean the more happiness you have, the more money you have, or vice versa. It really doesn't matter which way you say it because it's just a correlation. We don't know which thing comes first or second. We don't assume there's a causal relationship between them. All we are saying is that two variables are related together. Another example is the positive correlation between height and weight. The taller someone is, the heavier they are. A negative one is the relationship between elevation and temperature. The higher you go, the lower the temperature. And no correlation would be between how much tea that you drink and your level of intelligence. All right, hope that makes sense. Any questions, or does that not make sense to you? If you have any comment, please turn on your microphone and say something. Otherwise, I'm going on. Okay, correlation is not causation. The third variable problem is this. Two measured variables may both be the result of a third unmeasured variable. For example, imagine that there's a correlation. Actually, this is true. There is a correlation between viewing violent TV programs and behaving more violently at school, at least among children, not necessarily among adults like you. Now, the naive view is to say, because there's a correlation, so it must be that violent TV causes school violence. However, a more careful conclusion would be perhaps school violence encourages violent TV programming, or vice versa, or that both behaviors are jointly caused by some other factor, something more deep or unseen, such as having violent parents. So that third factor could explain the other two. So just because you find a correlation does not mean that one variable causes or influences the other variable. Both variables might be jointly influenced by some other variable and not toward each other. And here's a cartoon. The kid says, "I wish they didn't turn on the seatbelt sign so much. Every time they do, it gets bumpy." So the kid makes this wrong assumption that the seatbelt sign makes it bumpy. This is something that a kid could reason by himself and conclude. We are very good at making connections and postulating hypotheses about causality between events. It's in our nature to assume causality because it's more adaptive to assume something causes something else than to not assume. So assume in case it's true. That's how our species works. All right, the next kind of study is the interview study. This is a structured kind of study. It's like a job, a structured interview is like a job interview. There's not so much closeness between the experimenter and the participants. The same wording is used in every single interview. So it's a consistent wording in order to control extraneous factors like the particular word choice or the particular questions. it's appropriate for quantitative studies because quantitative means you want to add or average the results across participants, which you can do if it's a structured interview. But in an unstructured interview, it's loose and flexible and the participant can direct the conversation. It's like getting to know someone. This is more appropriate for qualitative research, where you want to describe how participants think and feel and answer and behave. And then there's the focus group, which is, it can be a structured interview or an unstructured interview. What makes it a focus group is that you test a group of people at a time. Maybe 6 to 12 participants are interviewed at the same time. The advantage is that you can get responses that are more realistic. Well, they might be more realistic or they might not be. When you test in a group, there's less pressure on the participant to please the experimenter. Participants may work together and talk together and think together. And that kind of thinking together and talking together may be a more accurate reflection of how people in the real world think and act and behave. On the other hand, you might find that behavior is more influenced by peer pressure in a group context, which would be a disadvantage for finding people's true opinions. So it's really up to the experimenter to decide what they're interested in measuring and finding, and depending on what they're looking for, different types of interviews are more or less appropriate. So it all depends on the experimental question or the hypothesis statement. All right. Next, there are questionnaire studies. These are like interview studies, so there can be structured questions. Usually if it's a questionnaire, it's always structured. So instead of asking the question out loud, you simply print it on paper and let the participant complete it with paper and pencil, or over the phone, or by internet. The advantage is quick and efficient. It's quick and efficient to collect a lot of data from a large sample of participants. Now, I happen to know that in behavioral economics, or the cross-discipline of economics and psychology, we're going to see a lot of large sample data. Because economics really is about the masses, about the population of people, not about individuals. So questionnaires are very popular in behavioral economics, that branch of psychology or economics that is between the two fields. It's ideal for quantitative studies. The disadvantage is that participants may rush. You can't tell whether they're taking their time or rushing. The particular words that you choose when you're phrasing the question matter. So if you change the wording of the question, you get different answers, different results, different ratings. And the representativeness of the sample might not be ideal for the kind of conclusions that you're trying to make. So for example, if you study economics students, do your results generalize to all students? If you study students at Chula, do these results generalize to students in all of Thailand or in all of the world? So this kind of representativeness of the sample needs to be considered and is a possible disadvantage when you're, well, this is a possible disadvantage of any study, really. Next, the items or questions can be open-ended or closed. Open-ended questions are used to obtain rich qualitative data, like informal interviews, or what did I call it? Unstructured interviews. Closed questions are more suitable for quantitative studies. So we would use closed questions in structured interviews and in questionnaires. And I want to read to you some examples of both. So, open-ended questions. One question could be, what sleep issues have you faced during university? Because you don't answer with the same kind of response for each participant. Different participants will answer that in different words, different ways of putting their thoughts together into a coherent response. A closed question, here are some examples. How much did you sleep last night? Because the answer is some amount, some number. It cannot be answered in all, like 1,000 different ways. It has to be answered with a number. So that's a closed question. Another is, how much sleep do you usually get on school nights? Another is, do you feel that you get adequate sleep? Now that could be a yes or no question, or it could be answered on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 means very inadequate, and 7 means very adequate, and 4 means somewhere in the middle. So you can have these rating scales, and these are also closed questions. Okay. Do you have any questions? Speak up if you do. All right. Observation studies. These can be overt or covert. Participants. The participant observation study is when the researcher joins the group to get closer to them and get more detailed observation. So this is a participant observation study. This is illustrated in this picture of a white guy sitting among a bunch of black people, presumably in Africa somewhere. And I just grabbed the picture from the internet. It's not necessarily a researcher studying them, but it gives you a pictorial example of how in participant studies, observation is done while being close to them to get more detailed observation. And then naturalistic studies are when a researcher records spontaneous behavior in a natural setting. So for example, you might study whether or not people are social distancing when they wait for trains on the SkyTrain system. You could do that, and that would be a naturalistic study. You might hold a clipboard and stand at a distance, maybe covertly, meaning secretly, observing them and counting how many people practice social distancing and how many people don't. That's a naturalistic study because you're in the natural environment. Whereas the earlier one, the participant study, it doesn't necessarily specify whether it's in a natural or controlled laboratory environment. And the third one, controlled. This is usually structured. Participants are assigned to groups and behavior is coded rather than described. And for that, I illustrate it here with this checklist here, where the researcher or assistant is coding behavior according to certain structured categories, and the behavior might take place in a structured or controlled environment, like in a laboratory. All right. So those cover all of the scientific methods of studying people, studying behavior. There are more methods, but those are the main ones. Ethical issues. Does the study cause discomfort for participants? We have to answer these ethical issues before we run a study, and we usually have to answer these questions to a committee or a board of a board of researchers. So for example, Chulalongkorn University has their research committee, and if you want to do research professionally, you need to apply for ethical permission from the university's ethical research committee, who will then decide based on your project proposal whether your study is ethical enough to conduct or not. And some journals are requiring evidence that you have received ethical approval to run your study and publish your results. So the benefits must be weighed against the detriments if we know that the study will cause discomfort to participants. Other questions we need to ask are, does it involve deception? Because if it does, then you need to debrief the participants soon afterwards. That means you need to tell them that you had deceived them somehow in some way about the study. Sometimes we need to deceive participants about the true nature of the study because we need to get their realistic, natural responses and not what they think they're supposed to answer to please the experimenter. Or because if they know what we're studying, that could change their behavior. So we might have to deceive them about the true purpose of the study. And then after the study is completed, we tell them, okay, actually, this is what we were really studying. Another question we need to ask is, do participants have a right to withdraw? They must have that right. Another is their confidentiality protected? It should be as much as possible. We should prevent their data from being shared because it could be potentially embarrassing or it could hurt their reputation. They just might not feel very comfortable with that data being, with themselves being identified with that data. Sometimes it can be embarrassing information that they provide. Is their informed consent obtained? Usually it should be, unless participation is not different than normal everyday experience. All right, I'm going to show you a little video. This is to illustrate how experimental studies are not always done ethically, and this one was done back in 1960s when we did not really consider the ethics of experimenting with humans, or anything really. Nowadays, we do consider the ethics of studies on humans and on animals and maybe even plants, mostly just humans and animals. So here's an example of a questionably ethical or unethical study.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. I went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is the word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you're instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this is all a simulation. Nothing is really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please. Go on.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of votes.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one. Let me out of here. Slow. Dance. Let me out of here. My eye's bothering me. Let me out of here. You don't know what you're doing here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Continue, please. Let me out of here. My eye's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich boy. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. The next phrase is fast. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Bird, car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher. That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast bird.
What we learned from the experiments is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
Okay. So that was an example of how an experiment could be designed to cause a great deal of psychological discomfort to the participant. The participant in this case was the one administering the shocks. Some of the participants later reported that they were very upset for days, even weeks, because of their participation in the study. They felt guilty and they felt like bad people. So this was not an ethical study, not a study that we would be allowed to conduct today. All right, the next slide is beware of bad studies. Studies with hasty conclusions and studies that were not well developed. We need to be hyper-vigilant against studies on hot topics because small findings can be taken as evidence supporting one side of a contentious issue, which will be broadcast widely to sway public opinions. We need to look for studies that look out for studies that incite moral panic with fabulous or shocking claims. If we see those studies, we need to really question them, look carefully at their methods, and try to be critical, asking questions about whether their design was fair and reasonable, their methods, and whether their results support their conclusions, or if there are alternate explanations for those conclusions. The misinformation effect can create global scale negative consequences and undermine public confidence in the news. This is terrible. Even when such studies are retracted and every news story corrected, not everyone will be updated. So researchers need to be careful. Researchers have shown that once people accept an idea, they become less motivated to challenge or change it. So once a result is published, and especially if it's publicized on the news, if that study was poorly conducted, if the results don't generalize to other studies, then it can be too late to undo the negative effect of false information. All right, now I would like to do a group activity with all of you. Okay, so I'm going to, first I'll talk about the words on the slide here. Beware of pseudoscience. The ice cream personality quiz is your activity today. The internet offers quizzes to help you find your perfect job, partner, and life. But are those quizzes valid? They are often invalid. If you can find a free quiz on the internet, chances are it's not valid. But we need to be careful about how much we believe in internet quizzes. So to show you, we're going to make an ice cream quiz, and then we're going to see by virtue of having created it ourselves how dubious the results are, the results that you could potentially get from taking the ice cream quiz. So an example is this: chocolate. You might say that chocolate represents someone who is a go-getter. That's a personality trait, a description of a person, and that they should go for a bold partner if they're using the quiz to see what kind of a person that they should choose in their life as a life partner, and that they will excel in business. So advice for a career. Sounds convincing, perhaps, because all of these traits may go together, and they might even seem to fit with chocolate as a bold flavor. It's just creative, imaginative writing, and it does not mean that it is true or false. So you need to train your mind to withhold judgment for or against claims that have seemingly no basis or questionable basis, questionable validity. So now I'm going to put you into groups using breakout groups, and I'm going to ask each group to select 5 flavors, maybe 1 flavor per participant, and then make up 5 descriptions of someone who would select that ice cream flavor. So if someone chooses a particular flavor from your list of 5 flavors, what does that mean about that person? That's what I want you to create and make up. So I want you to make up the meanings. So participants could take your quiz, they choose a flavor, and then they get the result, which is whatever you make up. You create some descriptions of what that kind of a person is, or any advice for that person. So you can offer lifestyle advice, career advice, whatever kind of descriptions and suggestions you like. This is just a creative activity. All right, so I'm going to start the breakout group now. Do you have any questions before I create the breakout groups? Any questions? Oh, I have a further explanation. 1 person in each group, write down all of your responses from the group. And I need you to turn that in to me for credit. Each of you will get 6 points today from your participation, your contribution to this group work. So as soon as you get in your groups, turn on your mics and begin talking, discussing with each other. And that 1 person that's recording all of the answers, whoever you decide it's going to be, that person needs to turn in your responses, perhaps as a photograph of your written responses, or sent as a file. Anyway, you're going to send your answers to me on the Blackboard course. In week 2, there's an assignment category for you to upload your answers to Blackboard. And you will get points for this assignment. Okay? Do you have any questions before I put you in your groups? I don't hear any questions, so I'm going to create the groups now. Okay, go to your groups now and complete this assignment. Okay, it looks like everyone is back in the classroom now. I hope that you had enough time to complete the ice cream quiz. If not, I hope that you got contact details from others in your class so that you can complete that, because you get points for that. I announced that in a little message to your groups. This can seem to be based on good, bad conclusions can seem to be based on good science, but they can be bad conclusions. So we have to be very critical consumers of science. New effects are appealing, but sometimes for a few years, a new effect is replicated, so it looks like it's a real thing. But then the tides will shift and the opposite effect will be found, and for years, other people will find the opposite effect. And then, after many years go by, people do studies to summarize the results of all previous work on this finding, and they might find that there's no effect at all, because people that found one way or the other way cancel out. For example, the effect of power poses in helping people to be more confident. It looks like that's an effect, but there's enough findings that it's not an effect that it calls into question whether it really is an effect or not. So when can we believe in studies? The real effects should stand the test of time. They should be true not only today, but yesterday, and 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 50 years ago. Meta-studies are studies of studies. So maybe there's been 50 studies of one effect. We can summarize those 50 studies and get a better estimate of the size of the effect, or to see if the effect is really real, if it can be found even after combining the results of many studies. That's called a meta-study. So we do have to be aware of bad conclusions. Even when it comes from good science, we need to be critical consumers. All right, and this is the last slide. Conclusions. Each method of psychological research is good, but imperfect. The experimental method is time-consuming and may have limited ecological validity, for example. So there's no such thing as a perfect method. All methods have their strengths and weaknesses. Using multiple research methods to study a question allows us to capture all of the advantages of each of those methods, which when you combine them together, they make up for one another's disadvantages. So if you get two study types, two methods, and do them both for the same research question, then the advantages of both can add together, and the disadvantages, maybe one study makes up for the disadvantages of the other study and vice versa. So they can kind of cover one another's bases and help to overcome the disadvantage of any single study. So a multi-method approach is the strongest and best method, to use multiple methods. This presentation is to convince you that psychology is a science. It grew out of philosophy, so it is often called an art, but it's really a science. The field began with its first psychological laboratory in 1887 and has always been firmly rooted in the scientific method. It is, with data and good reasoning, that the field continues growing. All right, so as I said before, you're going to submit your ice cream quiz to Blackboard, and you need to do that by today. The deadline is by midnight. Please enter all your group members' names, first and last name of every member in your group that worked with you and contributed to your group effort. Only one submission per group, please. So choose one member to submit for your group. That member will upload it to Blackboard. And this is how you upload to Blackboard. Here are the instructions. All right, so you can read that and follow the instructions. And if you cannot successfully submit your work to Blackboard, then you can email them to me if Blackboard doesn't work for you. But do try these instructions, it should work. I have uploaded the assignment category for you. Okay, now the last thing in class today is a pop quiz. So if you've stayed in class up to now, good for you. You get to participate in this quiz. It's 4 points, and this contributes to your grade, obviously. You need to complete it on Blackboard between 4 o'clock, oops, I said AM, I meant PM. Actually, I'm not gonna make that limitation. I'll change the time to any time between now and the next, it's gonna have to be done within 15 minutes. So after I finish this class, please go on Blackboard, and I will go on Blackboard immediately, and I will change the time to be from now until the next 15 minutes. I want you to work alone. This quiz is very simple to do. It's just 4 questions long, multiple choice. And if you have any problems, just contact me by email. And my PowerPoint is already on Blackboard, so you can download the PowerPoint there. You can see the instructions for how to upload your ice cream quiz assignment there in the PowerPoint. And you're going to upload your assignment on Blackboard, and you're going to take the quiz on Blackboard. So these 2 things together, they will give you your 10 points for today's class. And if you have any questions or comments about this lecture or about anything at all, you can contact me by email. It's nice to meet you all, nice to interact with you a little bit, and I'll see you again after the midterm